Hello there, and welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. So today we're going to be discussing what has been termed the Anti-BDS Bill. This bill originates from the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto pledge to quote unquote, ban local authorities from imposing their own direct or indirect boycotts, divestments, or sanctions campaigns against foreign countries. This pledge was formalized during the Queen's speech at the state opening of Parliament last year, in which Prince Charles, now King Charles III, stated that government, quote, legislation will prevent public bodies engaging in boycotts that undermine community cohesion. The Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill was subsequently tabled in Parliament by the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, Michael Gove, on 19th June this year. So in order to discuss this very, very important bill and wider topic, we're very pleased to be joined by two esteemed guests today. So firstly, John McDonnell MP. So John was born in Liverpool and raised in Norfolk. In 1981, he was elected to the Greater London Council as the member for Hayes and Harlington. John became chair of finance, responsible for the GLC's £3 billion budget. After the abolition of the GLC, he became head of policy at Camden Council and was chief executive of the Association of London Government before being elected in 1997 as the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington. From September 2015 to May 2020, John served as Labour's Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. We're also joined by June Pang. June is a policy and campaigns officer at the human rights organisation Liberty. She leads Liberty's campaigns to defend the UK's human rights frameworks and protect the right to freedom of expression, including the right to protest. She also works across the areas of migrants' rights, data protection, and criminal justice. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules this summer in order to join us today for this hugely important discussion. So I'm going to start first with yourself, June. Could you please tell us a bit more about the bill and particularly what it says?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kazim, for having me on. I think that the key thing to frame this discussion about the bill is to understand that it's fundamentally an attempt to stop public bodies from making ethical decisions about investment and procurement. And I'll go into some of the specific measures and some of the exact way that the bill is designed to stop this. But I think that the overarching point is that regardless of what is actually in the legislation and the precise way that it will work, the effect is fundamentally the same, which is to send a message and to create a chilling effect whereby the wider conversation about boycotts and divestment tactics of any kind for any cause is effectively prohibited or perceived to be prohibited. And as we've seen from the kind of in the round attack on freedom of expression, when people feel that certain kinds of expression are no longer allowed, or when there is kind of heightened legislative activity to ban it or prescribe it, that almost does the government's job or the job of the powerful for them, because it effectively creates a chilling effect whereby people feel that they're not able to do something. And I think that this bill is a really good example of that, and the kind of next step in the government's attack on freedom of expression in particular. So I'll kind of draw out some of the key substantive elements of the bill, and then I'm sure that we can kind of discuss why they're so problematic. At the core of the legislation is a general ban on public authorities, and that's including kind of government departments, local councils, but also schools, NHS trusts, public bodies as defined by the Human Rights Act, there's going to effectively be a general ban on these public bodies from, quote unquote, being influenced by political or moral disapproval of foreign state conduct when making procurement and investment decisions. This general ban is subject to a list of exemptions as set out in the legislation. I think most importantly, one of the key exemptions is that the Secretary of State can make regulations, so secondary legislation, to specify a country or territory to which the ban does not apply, and also exempt certain public bodies, functions, and also areas that the ban does not apply to. But specifically, the Secretary of State cannot make regulations disapplying the ban on boycotts if the foreign state conduct in question relates to Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, or the occupied Golan Heights. And there are no exceptions to this rule, in contrast to the other countries or territories. The only way to change this is through an amendment to the primary legislation, as opposed to by secondary legislation. Public authorities who are suspected of contravening the ban may be served with an enforcement, basically, procedure that will effectively could result in them incurring a really heavy fine, the exact amount of which will be defined by the Secretary of State later on. And also there's a wide raft of kind of investigative powers that are created by the bill that enable the enforcement body, whichever it is, to undertake this investigation. Finally, I guess one of the most kind of striking measures in the bill, obviously all of it is quite staggering, but there is an explicit so-called gagging clause, whereby a public body, as well as the individuals who in fact make a relevant procurement or investment decision, will not be allowed to say that they intend to boycott, or astonishingly, if the law were not in place, that they would have boycotted. And basically, if a public body or someone in the public body makes such a statement, that will count as a violation of the ban. And I think that, there's a kind of wide list of exemptions in the bill as well, in the schedule, that you can refer to by looking at the legislation, but we can go into a bit why some human rights organizations and environmental groups have argued that they're not comprehensive enough and they don't actually remedy the kind of harms that people have identified.
Thank you so much, June, for that very, very valuable overview into some of the more technical aspects of the bill, and definitely some of those elements that you drew upon we're going to touch on a bit more moving forward. So coming to yourself, John, what is your stance on the bill, and what do you see as some of the problematic features of this legislation?
To take it in its broadest form, we need to go through the history of how individual countries, individual governments even, or individuals themselves seek to influence international affairs, particularly when a state offends against basic tenets of human rights and civil liberties and behaves in such a way that people generally feel there needs to be some form of intervention. One of those interventions in the past has been to commit wars, to attack the country physically. Most of them, which on most occasions have resulted in even greater problems in terms of loss of life and the repercussions. So over time, as international law becomes established about how we can ensure there's some element of, we'd call it policing, I suppose, of the behavior of states, alternative interventions have been created to avoid having to take physical action, war basically. So to avoid military action, one way of seeking to influence a state's behavior has been diplomatic pressure, but then also what developed over time was how you can add to that diplomatic pressure by using financial pressures. And that includes boycotting and disinvestment, and then other forms of sanctions as well. And in many ways, when you look at the history of it, it's been the sort of creativity of how you can then shape an agenda which can influence states to behave, to adopt and also to maintain some form of commitment to human rights and civil liberties. And that's historically been developed, particularly since the Second World War. And the famous example is South Africa and apartheid, and how there was a commonality across many states about how you could influence the South African regime. And the BDS approach was one which many people look back now was possibly the most effective approach that could be utilized. And it did assist. If you listen to the speeches of the participants in the campaigns against apartheid in South Africa, Mandela and others, clearly BDS played a significant role. So people have learned from that, and over the years have tried to use their judgment of how effectively they could use boycotting, disinvestment and sanctions in their own way and what influence they can have. So it doesn't just fall to individual states to determine to collect together to use BDS as a strategy to bring about change for the benefit of all. Individuals and individual organizations have done. So, for example, in this country, individual local authorities, local councils have felt like they don't want to be associated and stand to one side when they see the perpetration of human rights abuses and attacks on civil liberties by individual states. So they want to express their views in some form. And where they have some financial role, to use their financial role to influence the agenda as best they can. And it's also gone into things like pension funds. And so that's become a legitimate form of seeking influence. And it's been generally accepted across certainly Western Europe and America. It's not, it's been argued against particularly by those countries who it's been used against, obviously, but it's been generally accepted as a useful strategy. So I go in the debate that's come forward, the government is trying to impose this view that the only sanctions or BDS that can be applied will be those ones that are authorized by the government itself. Well, again, that immediately undermines the independence of the individual local authorities, the pension funds, and others who wish to use their independent judgment about the actions that they take. But in addition to that, we get into this bizarre situation where even, as June has said, even the basic right of freedom of speech to say, actually, I believe that sanctions or BDS itself should be used against an individual country, even though the law doesn't permit it, I believe it should. Suddenly that becomes a crime. That's quite heavy by the sound of it. What the government is looking at is quite heavy sanctions against any local authority or anyone speaking in that way. So there's a whole range of attacks on civil liberties and human rights within our own country that's taken place as a result of this legislation. So when this proposal was brought forward, I think it's interesting. The reaction has been across political parties. We've had quite a number of Conservative MPs basically express their concerns on a whole range of issues. And in addition to that, we've had civil society organisations, I think, who've been shocked at the scale of the government's intervention on this issue. In Parliament itself, the debate that took place, unfortunately, I think it was used in some ways, as a political weapon as well by Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, who brought it forward. And I found the political debate demeaning, to be honest, because it focused on, and this is what Michael Gove said, it focused on this whole issue around Israel, when it's much broader than that itself, much broader than than just Israel. And then Michael Gove was, the allegation was, if you don't support this bill, in some way you're anti-Semitic. It became a political football in a way that I think, as I said, demeaned the whole debate. A number of us have been involved in a range of BDS campaigns on human rights issues on the basis it's a legitimate way in which we can bring about change. And in the parliamentary debate, I listed the various campaigns I've been involved in. I was involved in organising the demonstrations and calling for sanctions against Saudi Arabia when the Saudi Arabian leadership visited this country to see the Queen, and it was a royal visit. At the same time as that they, at that point in time, they were executing people and imprisoning them just for being gay. The same with the Bahraini regime. When the Bahraini regime a number of years ago perpetrated, I believe, a number of atrocities on those people who are simply campaigning for democracy in that country, and many of them are still arrested and locked up now, we call for sanctions then. At the moment, we've been campaigning around the issue of Sri Lanka and the treatment of Tamils and what many Tamils believe was an attempt at genocide happening there. So there's a long history of campaigns on BDS. And so this isn't just about Israel, but the government made the debate around Israel by including this bizarre exemption within the bill itself. So it became, I think it became a debate which did no credit to Parliament, to be honest, and it became it weaponized in a way which I think most probably will be used now until the next general election. Or the points that June pointed out, all of those points, thanks to Liberty for a wonderful briefing they provided and other organisations, all of those points were made. Legal opinions came in, Richard Hermer's legal opinion in particular, which was absolutely damning about the bill itself and its impact on freedom of speech and civil liberties in this country. And yet the government is driving it through. And where we're at now is its second reading took place. It will now go into committee stage and then will be brought back. I actually do think in the House of Lords this bill will be shredded because it's so appalling in its, as I say, in its riding roughshod over some very basic historic civil liberties that we have.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to come back to yourself, June, and sort of based on a lot of this sort of very valuable historical insight that John gave into BDS, I'm going to ask you a two-pronged question. Firstly, obviously a lot of your work is on sort of freedom of expression and the right to protest. What does the bill mean, firstly, for BDS as a tool of protest, not just for local authorities, but also for us as citizens more generally? And the second part of the question is, how interconnected do you feel this bill is within the government's wider assaults on human rights, especially given the fact that it was just last week the illegal migration bill became law in the context of the rights removal bill, which has now been thrown out. But in the context of the government's wider policy agenda, where do you think this bill fits in?
I think that, again, and I echo a lot of what John has already said, we have to remember that boycott as a tactic, as a political strategy, and as a way of leveraging kind of financial power in support of social change or trying to pressure for change, is a time-honored and historic tactic that has been successful in the past. And also it is recognized by the previous UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, as well as the European Court of Human Rights, as a form of expression protected by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And so I think it's really important to see this legislation as a direct attack on the ability of individuals to make themselves heard. And it's a kind of new direction. Well, it's not new, but it's a furthering of the government's kind of goal of essentially removing the ability of people to stand up for the things that they believe in. I think one of the most egregious parts of this is that boycott, divestment, sanctions tactics as a general principle are deliberately nonviolent, and also are kind of, the most emblematic way of people trying to make change without even engaging in any kind of so-called disruptive activity. Not to say that, disruption and direct action is bad in any way, but the government is kind of systematically shutting down freedom of expression by both targeting direct action through things like the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and the Public Order Act, criminalizing historic forms of direct action. And we did a lot of campaigning to try and resist this. And then on the other hand, now also trying to stop the ways that people protest by voting with their feet. And so you're kind of left with this situation where people will just, either because they fear direct, criminalization in the case of protest, or that they might risk their employer or their workplace or, their relevant public body from incurring these fines, be stopped from making their voices heard about the things that they care most about. And I think that that's one of the most concerning trends in legislation in the last few years that we've seen, and that is shown through this legislation. I just want to pick up on, I think, something John was speaking about in terms of the kinds of the power that's given to the government to effectively direct which countries can be boycotted. And of course, the government has already said that once this legislation is in place, it will exempt Russia and Belarus from the ban. And then there's a lot of kind of debate amongst especially conservative benches, but also kind of more widely about the potential to exempt China potentially. I guess this is also concerning from a kind of democracy standpoint, because the government and any government is never going to be at the cutting edge of human rights. And it's kind of an inversion of the democratic process, whereby potentially a locally elected council will not be able to make decisions that are more reflective of the voices of those whom elected it. Instead, they will have to kind of follow the direction and the orders of the central government, who are less, probably connected to the decisions of people in that particular community. And I think that kind of centralization of executive power is also something of great concern. I think more widely, you mentioned, Kazim, the wider attack on human rights that this bill sits within. Over the past few years, we've seen a kind of, as I said, systematic shutting down of the avenues that we can use to hold power to account, whether that's introducing voter ID or restricting judicial review, an attempt to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with the Bill of Rights Bill or Rights Removal Bill, shutting down the right to protest. And I think this is definitely a piece of legislation that falls within that broader sweep of legislation that attempts to take power away from individuals and to vest it in the executive and to lock people out of those democratic roots of influence. And I think on that basis, we really have to oppose it. And indeed, it's been really, I think, empowering and inspiring to see the breadth of civil society that has united, from trade unions to environmental groups to obviously Palestinian groups, Jewish groups, human rights groups. Kind of no one seems to think that this bill is a good idea. And so it really begs the question as to why this bill and why now, and of all the other things that the government could be doing, why is it doing this?
Thank you, June. John, I also wanted to ask you, how do you think the bill will impact the overall landscape of democratic rights and responsibilities in the UK, given everything that we've discussed today?
Just following on from June, after the Second World War, there was a professor at London School of Economics, Harold Laski, quite famous at the time, not much read these days, but it's worth reading again. And there was a big debate about fascism, how it arose, had all the issues around the publications, Hannah Arendt and others. Hal Lasky said, look, if you look at in Britain, fascism won't come with a general marching up and down with medals on his chest or anything like that. That won't happen. But what we have to guard against is the incremental development of a conservative authoritarianism. No one can describe what we're seeing now as fascism. At times people talk about proto-fascism, but I think if you go back to Lasky, I think he's accurate in that incremental development of this sort of conservative authoritarianism, so incremental that actually you barely notice some elements of the erosion of basic civil liberties because they're coming over time, or sometimes you don't notice them because it's coming at you on so many fronts, you're just interested in your particular area. And that's what we've seen in recent years, and I think it's deeply worrying. June's gone through the whole range of those issues. I just add to that, how do people express their views or in many ways protect themselves? With regard to this legislation, what was interesting is that this permeates right down to pension funds. And a number of Conservative MPs, and I did as well, said one of the pension funds that's being targeted is the local government pension fund. I'm a member of that pension fund. And as one Conservative MP said, this is my money. It was quite interesting coming from a conservative libertarian position, saying this is my money that I've invested in my pension fund. What right have you to take control of where that money is invested? And if I don't want to be associated with my money associated in investing in companies that operate within a regime that is abusing human rights, what right have you got to stop me expressing my view on that? So it really does, it just permeates right down to some basic elements of decision making about one's resources and one's attitudes that maybe we've not seen in this country for a long period of time, if ever. And it goes on, it goes on. And as June has said, it's linked to a whole range of things. I add to that the issue with regard to the attack on trade union rights. We've now got, for the first time in our country, we've now got an assault, so some for over a century anyway, we've now got an assault on the basic right to withdraw one's labour, on the minimum services bill. Trade unions now will be forced to tell their members to break a strike. Individual trade unionists will be forced to go to work, even though they're voted to strike. And if they don't, they'll lose their jobs or the union will be fined. This is nothing, we haven't seen that for maybe 2 centuries under the Combination Acts that were taking place at the time of the formation of trade unions. So it's just at the moment, we're being assaulted in a whole number of fronts. And sometimes it's difficult to keep up with it all and put them all together. And in addition to that, some of them are small erosions of civil liberties. And the best example has been given by June, the way in which the basic electoral practices are now being changed, the identity, you have to identify, that sort of thing. So another group of people will not be able to exercise their right to vote or be incentivized to do that. So I think it's deeply worrying. And it is that growing conservative authoritarianism that's taking place. And it's interesting, it does offend against not just our own civil liberties, but in this bill in particular, and let's take with regard to Israel, it offends against international conventions that our own government has signed up to. Because as part of this bill, whereas in the past, the BDS has been campaigning to target those areas, that Palestinian areas that have been occupied by Israel, so goods coming from that area to be boycotted, this groups the whole of Israel together, completely contrary to everything in terms of international conventions that this government has actually signed up to. So there's a whole range of contradictions in this bill. And June, I agree with June, what has been quite remarkable in this particular piece of legislation, it's welded together a huge coalition of organizations and individuals, on cross-party individuals, who are saying this bill should not stand. That's why I think in the coming period, in many ways, I think the government knows this bill will have a very rough ride, both in terms of not just the House of Commons, but more importantly now the House of Lords, because the Conservatives have such a majority in the Commons. In some ways, I think it might well be that the government is not that invested in actually seeing the legislation through, because actually it's most probably more of a political act than it is a legislative foundation stone for the future, but we'll see. Either way, we've got to try and secure as much, well, defeat the bill if we can, but seek the amelioration of it, definitely. And then hopefully secure a cross-party agreement that after the next election, it'll be reversed, because it is such a dramatic assault on civil liberties.
Thank you, John. I think sort of, as you've alluded to now, kind of looking forward as to where we go from here, the fact that the bill will most likely come back into Parliament in September, and we see kind of what trajectory the government will take with that. June, sort of what responsibility do we have, firstly as individuals, right, as citizens, and secondly as civil society organizations in combating this bill, and what can we do in order to make our voices heard in response to it?
I think it's a really good question. And of course, we can't forget the wider context, which is that we might, have a general election, or we will have a general election in the next year. And so regardless of where you live, who represents your constituency at the moment, I think as individuals, we really have to take this opportunity to speak to our representatives and to really rally behind calls to A, oppose this legislation, B, oppose the wider attacks on freedom of expression and our human rights frameworks that have emerged in the last few years. And to really link both of those to our own individual experiences. I think that the most powerful thing that we can all do is to really see these pieces of legislation not just as abstract attacks on our rights, but practical limitations on our ability to speak out on the things that we believe in. And it's really important and vital, really, to not be jaded by obviously the last few years, the last decade, and to still persist in trying to speak to whoever represents us to say that this actually does not represent us. And actually, we have a lot of reasons why we would like you to oppose this legislation. And if you don't oppose it, then, your vote is not guaranteed. And I think that it's really important as well to resist the government narrative on the legislation. Obviously, it's being very specifically targeted and focused on the issue of Israel-Palestine. But as the many trade unions, environmental groups, other kind of groups, including, for example, Uyghur-led groups, have highlighted, this legislation impacts upon many more people and many more causes and many more countries and human rights abuses than just those that the government would like to frame it as. So I think that's really key. As civil society organizations, I think, the same applies. It's really important to be in solidarity with the groups that are opposing this legislation. Of course, there's the Right to Boycott Coalition that groups can join, but more widely, I think that any group that works vaguely on human rights or international kind of supply chains or trade justice or kind of anything that has a bearing on the UK's international human rights abuses situations really need to look at this legislation and think through how it impacts them. Because for how wide the coalition to oppose the bill already is, I think a lot of organizations haven't quite understood the kind of gravity of this legislation. And it's totally forgiven. Like it's been a very busy legislative session. It's been very long, and we've had a lot of various attacks that we've all had to kind of put our minds to, but it's important not to let things that the government is portraying as like quite narrow slip between the net, and then realize at the end of it that it will have a really significant impact on, you know, your daily operations, but also your campaigning goals. And of course, kind of on the election point in particular, I think that, as John alluded to, this legislation is one of many pieces of legislation that many organizations will be calling for repeal of. And I think that it's important to start thinking about whatever next government comes into power, keeping up the pressure to ensure that our rights are respected and expanded rather than continue to be restricted. And I think this is, you know, one of those pieces of legislation that there is no redeeming, even if the House of Lords takes sledgehammer to it and the Commons, if the government is forced to accept minor concessions, ultimately we can expect, based on the trajectory of previous legislation, that it will be largely unchanged. Probably, maybe that's just me being pessimistic, but I think that is probably likely. And so we really need to work together to ensure that its harms are mitigated while the legislative process is unfolding, and then afterwards, how do we challenge it, whether that's in the courts or through political means.
Thank you, June. John, I'd just like to give you the last word on this. Is there a positive way that we can end this conversation when we look forwards in terms of this bill?
2 points. One, there is a positive way in the sense that this legislation has added to the waking up of people about the threat of civil liberties in this country. I think increasingly now, more and more people, civil society organisations and individuals, and the media to a certain extent as well, as begin to wake up to just how much what we've expected and experienced in the past by way of our basic civil liberties and rights, how much they're being eroded. And this is one of those bills that's like almost a tipping point bill, if you like. But as Juna said, people come to it with their own experiences, you know, and I think that's the best way as well. And I'll give one example. A number of us in Unite the Union have been campaigning with regard to sanctions on the Chinese administration because Unite members, colleagues, friends of mine in Hong Kong who've been involved in various industrial disputes, international disputes, British Airways, things like that, have been arrested and are still in prison now, 2 years on. And so therefore, because some of these examples become very individualized, but then in that way, people relate to them better because they can see actually just how much it affects them individually and their friends or their colleagues or their organization. And the more examples we draw out on that, the more angrier people get about this piece of legislation. Final point from me as well, and I have to be completely honest about this, that when the legislation came up in Parliament, the Labour front bench, the Labour Party, put forward what they call a reasoned amendment. I know this parliamentary procedures are bizarre at times, but this reasoned amendment declined to give the bill a second reading, but then also gave the option for the government to again come forward with a better form of the bill. I think that was a fundamental mistake, and then Labour MPs were asked to abstain on the next vote, the second reading vote. A number of us didn't. We voted against because I think, as Juna said, this bill cannot be improved. It's such a fundamental assault on basic civil liberties that it has to be opposed. So we have to win the argument across all the political parties now that this is so fundamental. This type of legislation in this form or any other has to be rejected. And what would be better, exactly as Juna said, what would be better is a much broader discussion about how we consolidate and build upon the civil liberties and human rights within this country, and how we can then effectively build upon the rights that we have that then we can use to extend basic civil liberty and human rights protections elsewhere. And that's the debate we need to go to in the general election campaign now, and move on in a much more positive way. And as I say, the encouraging thing about this is the scale of opposition that there's been, but the breadth of that opposition across our society. So I'm encouraged by that, and I actually do think we'll win this argument over the next 18 months.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was quite an appropriate way to end what has been a very, very fascinating discussion that I'm sure could have gone on for many more hours yet. Thank you so much to both of yourselves. Firstly, John McDonnell MP, for joining us today, and also to June Pang for joining us and for both providing your expert insights into this bill, the Anti-BDS Bill. And the debate around this bill is certainly not over. We will be back most likely in September discussing this again, whether on our podcast or in other forums as well, in Parliament, etc. So do keep up with, particularly with Liberty's work. As John mentioned, Liberty have put out a brilliant briefing on this legislation. So do check it out and do keep track of any campaigns on this bill. And make sure you keep up with the work of the Community Policy Forum here on YouTube, the platform that you'd be listening to our podcast on, and also on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you so much again to both of you for joining, and thank you to all of our listeners. Bye-bye.